So yeah, look at
Okay, so Nicole, Nicole Khoury, Khoury, and I was part of the Father Robinson criminal defense team.
Okay. Describe your role on the defense team and tell us how you became involved in the case.
So I was a very young attorney. I was 28 when the Father Robinson trial started, and I was working on my own, both for the public defender's office and as a criminal defense attorney. But I also, from the time I was in law school all the way through my career, was doing research for Alan Connop. And I then became a lawyer and was in his office building as well, right across from John Thebes. So when this case came about and John and Alan decided to represent Father Robinson, there were a lot of really unique issues for research that needed to be done because the case was so old. So they brought me on to kind of do all that research and to sit, I'd call myself third chair to the trial.
So as a 28-year-old,
Yeah.
what kind of research were you in charge of doing for that case?
So the craziest thing that I did was the ancient document rule. A 20-year-old case, a lot of these people are not going to still be around. And so there were a lot of documents that we needed to figure out if we could get them into evidence or not. And I did all of the research and writing on that, and a lot of, I actually talked to my old evidence professor, Ron Raitt from University of Toledo. I went and had a whole meeting with him about it because the only time I had ever heard about the rule or used anything with it was in evidence class in law school because it's so rarely used. So that was probably the biggest one. And then there were a lot of motions to suppress and motions in limine, things about whether evidence was still available, whether it was preserved correctly. Those kinds of things were the biggest research products that I had to do.
Can you explain to me briefly about that evidence rule?
Probably not. I don't want to say the wrong thing right now. It has something to do with the fact that it was 20 years old and whether you can introduce documents but don't.
Maybe if someone's not around to speak to them?
Right. I mean, we're talking about police reports and things like that and statements that were made in police reports by people who are no longer living. And so how do we introduce those things based on the fact that they're no longer living, and obviously it's no fault of anybody's that they're not here. And because the case is a cold case, can we reintroduce some of those documents?
Yeah, I want to go down that road a little bit more. What do you think, looking back, were some of the greatest challenges in preparing this defense? You had limited direct physical evidence and memories that had faded over time, deaths in the case.
So in my opinion, the biggest problem trying to prepare for the case was just the attention to it and the outside thoughts about the case, not from us, from the lawyers, but from the general public. I mean, you're hearing everybody, and you have to put all of that out when you're trying to research it and prepare for a case like this. And yeah, there were a lot of people that weren't alive. So there were people that we, even throughout the trial, as the trial started, and as we were learning things from the trial, we're like, oh, it would be really nice to have this person here so we could question this person right now, and they're dead, and there's nothing you can do about it. So that was really, really difficult, but I thought we did a remarkable job with what we had to work with.
Mm-hmm. How did you guys approach evaluating and challenging some of the forensic evidence that the prosecution brought forward, especially when they put the letter opener kind of in the bone and said it turned like a lock? How did you guys approach that?
Well, first and foremost, we absolutely attacked the way that the coroner's department went about analyzing whether the weapon fit into the mandible, and we had our own experts. We used nationally recognized experts, and we had them come, and they, in my opinion, we had a forensic answer for everything that they threw at us. When they said it was a letter opener, we had an expert who said that it was very possible that it was a pair of scissors, which was the one thing that was missing from the scene was Sister Margaret's scissors that she used to cut the wicks for services. That was something that was missing, and that was an aha moment that John Thebes had. One night late, he had all this evidence in his hand, and he dropped it. And when he looked down, there was the picture of the blood spatter on the cloth, and it was upside down. And when he looked at it upside down, he goes, "Oh my gosh, that looks like a pair of scissors." And then we went from there, and we sent that to experts, and we had experts testify, including, I believe, their own expert, the prosecutor's own expert said, I can't rule out that it was a pair of scissors.
What were some of your strategies and decisions, your strategic decisions you felt were important, but maybe the public didn't quite get on board with or understand?
So the one thing we didn't want to do was find another assailant. We didn't want, if I'm correct, I believe the Scott Peterson, Lacey Peterson trial was right around that time. And in their case, they went and tried to pin it on several different people. It could have been this person. And then at that point, you kind of feel like the burden shifts to the defense. Like now all of a sudden we have to prove that it's this person and that it's not, that they didn't prove that it's our person, right? So one of the things we didn't want to do was go down that road. We really, really focused on having an answer for all of the things that they threw at us. Like I said, the letter opener was the big thing. I mean, that was their big aha, right? However, in the original coroner's report, the coroner at the time said it was consistent with a pair of scissors. And then again, when you flip that picture upside down, it was very consistent with a pair of scissors, and we had our experts say that, and I believe their expert did not deny that. The DNA was huge. None of the DNA that was found at the scene belonged to Father Robinson, not the DNA that was underneath her fingernails. And I think that was a really big deal for us. If it would have been found that it was Father Robinson's, the state would have been screaming from the rooftops, the DNA matches, right? Well, in this case, it wasn't. And to me, having a 70-year-old nun, having a man's DNA under her fingernails, and I believe, if I remember correctly, that it came back that it was blood included. Where is that going to come from? I mean, this isn't an average person who's going out, to the club or going out where she's around a bunch of people and might run into them and get somebody's fingernail. I mean, you have to have somebody's male bloody DNA under your fingernails. And she's a nun, and she lives her life in Mercy Hospital, or Mercy College. And how are you going to explain that away? And that was what we focused on. We focused on the science, and we focused on the fact that we didn't believe that their science was proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And that was our whole case, that's what the whole justice system relies on, was it proven beyond a reasonable doubt? And we believed we had far more doubt than reasonable doubt. And unfortunately, the jury just didn't agree with us.
Which is surprising because juries love DNA, and you would think that would be the thing that they would hang their decision on, is that DNA. Did that shock you that there was a conviction despite that DNA?
I was pretty shocked, yeah. The verdict came back quick. I think it was like 6 hours. And when it came back quick, I thought, this is good news. I really did. I thought it was good news. I thought to myself, there's no way they could have gone through hundreds of exhibits, watched an hour-long video, and gotten a verdict that quickly. So yeah, I was really shocked. But in my opinion, I believe the court of public opinion outweighed the evidence that was presented. That's my opinion. That's how I felt then. That's how I feel now. And I just think that this is a very, very, a very unique case, a horrible case. And this woman who has no enemies died in a horrific way. And you want to find somebody guilty. And I believe that's why they did.
So you brought up the court of public opinion a few times. Do you think are you saying that the jury that you guys all agreed upon did in fact let that outside influence, maybe media reporting, influence their verdict?
I believe that you had such a sympathetic victim and such a unique case, again, that they wanted to find somebody guilty, and that they believed that the state's case and the state did their job and proved their case. I don't believe it was beyond a reasonable doubt, though. And I think that when you mix that human element of being on a jury, look, we're putting 12 people in a box who have no background in the law. You're giving them law on pieces of paper, and you're saying you get to play judge and lawyer right now, and you have to decipher all of this stuff that's written down on paper. And you know, when a jury comes back with a question, it's not like it just automatically gets answered. I mean, we have to be very careful about what we're allowed to answer and how we're allowed to answer it. So many times, it's like what you get to know is what's written there. So you have to decipher that. And you literally are taking people who have no background in stuff that we've been trained in for years and years and years, and you're telling them to make the most important decision of their lives.
I want to talk about the strategy because, you know, you said she was a sympathetic person. Was there a strategy? I know some people believe that there was heavily a strategy on the defense's part to make him appear old and frail, and they've even suggested that maybe that was part of your role, is to make him appear that way. And then there's, of course, the decision to have him in his frock. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I don't think there was anything from us that I mean, he's a priest and he's old. So, I mean, you can't change that. He's wearing what he wears every day. You know, it wasn't like we were taking, you know, somebody who's got a really hard demeanor and putting them in a lace doily, you know, and telling them to act a certain way. I mean, this is who he was. He was frail. He was old. He was very quiet. I think he smiled, you know, once during the trial. As a matter of fact, I think one of the news outlets caught that picture because there's a picture of him and I, and he's smiling. And it if I remember correctly, it's when John Thebes tripped over the tripod, and everybody got a chuckle, you know. That was him. So, I mean, it wasn't like we told him act a certain way. Have I done that in the past? Absolutely. But you didn't have to with him. This is who he was. He's exactly what you saw was exactly who he was. You know, like I said, I don't know how you tell a priest to not wear what he wears every day, you know.
I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of what was going on in the Catholic Church between 1980, when the murder happened, and 2006. Do you believe that had all of the factors been the same and this case was prosecuted after it happened, that we would have gotten the same outcome? Because I think from 1980 to 2006, the church sex scandal happened. People's minds and hearts changed a bit.
I don't believe that we would have gotten the same outcome if it would have been tried right away, but not necessarily because of things revolving around the Catholic Church, but more because, you know, that original coroner's report said it was a pair of scissors, right? So there's that. We didn't even hear about the letter opener really at that point. And yeah, I think that, again, you're taking 12 normal people and you're telling them to forget everything that they've heard, everything that they've seen, everything that they've learned, and only focus on this. Human nature tells you that's not going to be possible in a case this big, that they're able to literally forget about everything that they've heard or learned over the last 20 years and how they feel personally. You know, voir dire is a very tricky thing, but you don't know if these people are, you do your best, you do the best that you can. I mean, I think we did voir dire for 4 days maybe. I mean, we went through tons and tons of jurors to get to where we were, you know, but you just don't know. Like I said, human nature is the biggest element that I think comes into being a juror, is can you really follow the law? Can you really follow what beyond a reasonable doubt means? Can you really put aside all of your feelings that you may have and all of the things that you've heard? And all of the things that you believe or may have formed opinions on in the past, can you really put all of that aside to be a good juror? And you know, same thing. It's us looking at them saying, do we really believe that this person up there is telling us the truth during these questions and answers? Mm-hmm. It's a very, 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 very tricky process, and it's almost an art form. Alan Conop is very, very good when it comes to voir dire. You know, I'm not going to sit here and say we picked the wrong jury or that I would have wished we would have had this person instead of that person. Not at all. But I do think it's very difficult to put all of that stuff aside in a case this big with a sympathetic victim and a case where you want closure to it. Everybody wants closure to it. I just believe that the closure wasn't achieved the right way.
I know that the prosecution did not want to, similar to how you guys didn't need to do a third-party defense, they did not go the satanic route. They were concerned because they just didn't feel that they could ask people to go that far with it. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, they didn't, but they did. They still put a priest from Chicago who's an expert in satanic rituals up on the stand and let him testify. But then in closing arguments, they said this wasn't about satanic rituals. So you tell me.
A couple of the people that we're talking to about this story, they said, we've been interviewed over and over and over again all throughout the years. It's very important to us that this story, if we agree to interview, includes the fact that there was a Catholic cover-up. They believe that, going back to Monsignor Jerome Schmidt, that he intervened in that police interview and took Father Robinson out. They believe that the prosecution knew back in 1980 that he had committed this murder, Father Robinson, and that there were many lengths that the church itself went to keep him out of the crosshairs. Did you ever come across any of that in your research, or any indication at all that was the case?
No, I mean, I know there were a lot of allegations that kind of kicked this investigation back into high gear 20 years later. Those allegations, in my opinion, were very, very extreme. Very, very extreme. And so extreme that it made it, for me, hard to believe. And I don't believe, I mean, there's still, it's not that just the alleged assailant was part of the Catholic Church. The victim was too. So how would the church want to, you want to cover up the alleged assailant, but
disturbing part about that theory. I mean, I think from our meeting with the prosecutors the other day, that is the disturbing part. He had full Christian burial, never defrocked despite the conviction. She was kind of, nuns. I went to a Catholic school. They were like kind of the mean ones that hit you with a ruler, and sometimes the priest can be described as, loving and fatherly and things. So
I don't get at all that anybody ever painted Father Robinson as lovingly and fatherly. He was consistently, yes, there were some reports that she was very strict. And the biggest thing was how strict she wanted the church to be in the proper order for the services. And this was Easter weekend. So, you had Holy Thursday and Good Friday, or I'm sorry, you had Thursday and then Good Friday and then Holy Saturday when this all happened. And, there were some reports that she was not happy with the condition that the church was left in from the Good Friday services on Holy Saturday. Did we explore that? Yeah, we did. And we did bring that out, so if she's unhappy, what does that have to do with Father Robinson? Why would that all of a sudden mean that he is the one that went into this rage and decided to kill her on Holy Saturday? For all intents and purposes, though, they did not paint Father Robinson out in this glowing light. He was, if anything, there were a lot of people saying, he was because he was so quiet, or he was squirrely, and because he wasn't overly friendly. He wasn't overly fatherly. That there was something behind his eyes. I remember people saying that. So, if you're going to cover something up, I don't think it's to protect him. I think it's maybe to protect somebody else, but certainly not to protect him. I don't think that it was like
the clergy as a whole. You don't think it was to protect clergy as a whole, or the Catholic Church as a whole?
No, I really don't. I mean, is anybody out to protect the people that are in their inner circle? Sure. I mean, you could say the same thing about anybody. Your family who protects you even though you committed a crime. But do I think this was a big church cover-up? I really don't.
Okay.
I really don't.
Let's go back to the jury selection. Obviously critical, because you're not asking, I think a big misconception is people in the public think you're asking them, have you ever heard of the case? And you're not. You're asking them to overlook whether they've heard of the case and make a fair decision. How did your team think about potential juror bias, especially given the religious setting and the graphic nature of what did happen to this nun?
I think with all voir dire, you really have to hone in on, can people, where do your sympathies lie? Do your sympathies do you have the police in your family? That's one of the questions people ask, you know. So does that mean that you're going to, no matter what, believe every single word the officer says? You know, do you watch TV, and do you believe that this is the way that the real life court system works? Do you, do you belong to the Catholic Church? Do you not belong to the Catholic Church? Because that does, I think, play a big role in this. I'll be honest with you, going back 20 years, do I remember specifically the questions we asked? No, but I can tell you that we felt comfortable with the jury when we picked them. And I can tell you that we did this for 4 days. And I can tell you that we all agreed on the jury. And like I said, you know, I don't know that we picked the wrong jury. I just don't know that the jury truly understood or believed what reasonable doubt was. And I do believe that we were able to overcome that. I really do.
What about the atmosphere in the courtroom? Can you remember that,
Oh, yeah.
particularly as
Yeah.
these jurors are hearing about the details
Yep.
of this crime?
It was, the whole time was tense. It was tense between the defense and the prosecution. And you have to remember, we're all friends then and we're friends now, but during that trial, it was very, very, very tense. You could cut the tension with a knife. You know, it was, we really tried to follow everything by the book. You know, the jury was only hearing what the jury was supposed to hear. You know, there was security. They were only letting a certain amount of people come in at a time, but then you'd walk outside of the building and you'd have news crews from all over the world. The Vatican was here. Court TV was here every day. You know, so it was very, very, very intense. We had to drive in through the underground, through the tunnel, through the jail tunnels, just to get in the door. It was an intense situation for everybody, and it was long. You know, it was 3 weeks long, I think, after voir dire, 2.5 weeks, I think, something like that. And so these, you know, jurors are there every day, and they're being told, well, when you go home, you know, you can't talk to anybody, you can't look at your news, you can't look at your emails, you can't look at, I don't even know, in 2006, were we texting? Probably not as much, right?
Just a bit.
You know, but it was a very tense situation throughout the entire time.
How has your work on this trial, if at all, informed the way that you approach your role now as judge?
Beyond a reasonable doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt. That when, like I said, I was 28 years old. I'd been practicing law for 4 years, and I was spent after this. I was exhausted emotionally. I was exhausted physically. I didn't know that I could do this anymore because I was so convinced that we were able to rebut all of the things that they proved, or that they thought that they proved. I really believed that we had enough there that there was doubt, reasonable doubt, more than reasonable doubt in my opinion, but reasonable doubt at least. And it took me quite a while before I was able, I mean, of course I had to work, so I kept working, but I was really selective about the cases I was taking. I was exhausted. That being said, as a judge, I take that beyond a reasonable doubt very, very seriously. And it is a very large burden to prove. And that has absolutely, absolutely swayed the way that I do things in the courtroom.
Mm-hmm. And I assume Phoebes was helping you, you know, get over that, maybe move on, because he's more experienced than you. You only have the 4 years.
Yep.
Maybe advising you, you know, sometimes this is the way
Yep.
the justice system works.
Well, John and Alan afterward, you know, when Father left, he certainly, I wouldn't say he was at peace with it, but he had accepted the decision. And so, you know, yeah, these guys have been doing this for a lot longer than I had. And you get the next case. And when you get the next case, you know, you take what you learned and you go forward, you know. Unfortunately for me, you know, I had 2 murder trials before that were not guilties. So this was my first real big guilty, when it was a big one, you know. And that was hard because the other 2 cases were really big cases too. And you just felt, being young and being less experienced, well, this is the same way it felt for the first one, so it's going to be the same result, right? And it certainly wasn't.
What do you think is the most misunderstood piece of the Robinson trial, maybe by those who've only seen it in the headlines, as someone who was in the thick of it?
Again, I think that when you take the fact that there's this DNA evidence that belongs to a man, and that's blood, and it's under a nun's fingernails, anybody else in the world would say, oh, he must have been found not guilty. And you're like, oh, nope, he was found guilty. I mean, that's the biggest thing that I take away from this. That, in addition, like I said, to the fact that we have, we rebutted that it was the letter opener. We made a very good case that it could have been the scissors. And right there, again, that's doubt. And all we're looking for is doubt. It's not our job to prove it was scissors, right? It's just our job to prove, or to rebut the fact that they have proven that it was the letter opener. And so that is what, when people are like, oh, well, he was found guilty, because I've had people say, oh, they had DNA. Yeah, they did. It wasn't his. Oh, really? You know, oh, I didn't know that. That's the big thing. That's the thing that people are always like, how did they find him guilty after that? That's a big thing to me.
So knowing that, and now having all these additional 20 years of experience, is there anything that you would play differently or do differently? Nothing at all?
Not a thing.
Anything
I would not have done.
Keep you up at night about this?
There's one thing that, and I'm not going to disclose it, but I will say that during the trial, one of the witnesses testified to something that none of us knew that this witness was going to testify to. And when this person testified, we all looked at each other like, oh my God, it could have been this other person who could have done it. And we went back and we said, what do we do? How do we do? We don't want to get rid of our plan. And unfortunately, that person is dead. So we didn't have anything we could do. It's not like we could exhume a body and get DNA overnight and do we couldn't. There's nothing we could do. Had we known that this person was going to testify the way they did, we knew what they were going to say generally, but we had no idea the specifics that they were going to get into, we would have absolutely explored that road.
So that was a prosecution witness?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Tell me about Father Robinson. What was he like?
He was quiet. He was meek. He followed instructions. He did, we went through everything. The video they played of him in the interrogation room, that we had a expert try to pull his voice out a little bit more so we could decipher what he was saying. That was a big video in there. And that was exactly who he was. He rarely talked. I mean, what you saw was exactly who he was. There was no, again, we weren't trying to polish a penny. He was exactly the way that he portrayed himself in that trial. And he trusted us. And he definitely trusted Jack Callahan and trusted John because he knew them. And never told us, never was upset with us, never said, I wish you wouldn't have done this or that. He told us his story. His story was always consistent. It was always the same thing over and over and over and over again. And when you kind of put that timeline out, and when you'd say, gosh, the way the timeline works, the way the prosecutions put it out and the way people have testified, he would have literally been running around Mercy Hospital for like an hour and a half, the way that the timeline worked. Like, it just doesn't make sense. It just didn't make sense. And then you couple that with the scissors and you couple that with the DNA and you say, there's doubt.
And do you have an alternate suspect in your mind? Is it the one that was mentioned by the prosecution witness?
Yes, I do. They weren't mentioned by it, but there was something that this witness stated that made us believe that we could have had another viable suspect.
Mm-hmm. And your partner, Thebes, he said he doesn't know if he did it, but you say what, definitively?
Definitively, there's no way I know, but it makes a lot more sense than the Father Robinson theory.
Okay. Is there anything you want to add that I didn't ask?
It was a whirlwind trial. The whole world saw it. The whole world followed it. It was unique. It was one of its kind. I give all the respect in the world to juries. I think that juries are given an impossible task. Again, you give them a bunch of words on paper and you say you have to become a lawyer or a judge, and you have to make the most Probably one of the most important decisions of your entire life. And that's one of the things we say a lot of times in voir dire. This is to rank up there with the most of important decisions you're ever going to make in your life. This is somebody else's future. And it's not just the defendants, it's also the victims, right? It's their family. What happened to Sister Margaret never should have happened, ever. Whoever is responsible, whether it's Father Robinson or whether it's not, you know, I would love to know the truth. Everybody always asks, is there one day in history you'd go back to? It's not the birth of Christ. It's not the day JFK got shot. It's April 5th, 1980. I want to know what happened that day exactly. That is the day I would go back in history if I could go back in history, because I would really, in my mind and in my heart, would love some closure with this. I probably never will have closure because I can't time travel, but that is the day for me that I just wish I knew exactly what happened. And unfortunately, there's nobody here to tell us anymore. Nobody. So.
Just about everybody agreed that he was guilty. And there was one person that was kind of a holdout. But what they fixated on was the letter opener was the murder weapon.
Yep.
And if the letter opener
Yep.
was the murder weapon, he had to have done it.
And I agree with that. I agree that if you believe the letter opener was the murder weapon, then he had to have done it. What I don't agree with is that did they pay attention and did they listen to all of the rebutting evidence of that? Okay, so again, the original coroner report said it was a pair of scissors. The only thing missing from the crime scene were her scissors that she used to cut the candle wicks, that she had with her all the time, and we had testimony to that. We had our expert say it's consistent with a pair of scissors. We had their expert say, yes, it could be, and I believe it was Dr. Henry Lee who said it could be consistent with a pair of scissors, okay? It was only the coroner who stuck the letter opener into the mandible directly that said, this is the murder weapon. Our expert said that is not the way you do this. You make a mold of it. You have a body that's been in the ground. First of all, a 71-year-old body that's been in the ground for 20 years. You don't just go and stick it in the bone. And I believe our I can't remember her name right now, but our expert, they based a whole TV show off of her, the TV show Bones. That was her expertise, was in bones. That's what she did. She said, absolutely not. That is not what you do. You make a mold of it, and then you try the weapon. You don't just stick the weapon in there. That was all done. We weren't invited to the party. I remember Alan Conop said that. We weren't invited to the exhumation. We weren't invited to the coroner going in and doing all these things. We weren't there for any of that. We weren't part of it.
Did you even know they were going to exhume her body?
I don't know when we came in. I mean, I know John came in right when she was arrested. I don't remember if they exhumed her before that or not. I really don't. But yes, I agree. If you believe that letter opener was the weapon, then they were going to find him guilty. But how in the world can you not say there was reasonable doubt that was the weapon? After everything that we did, after everything we showed. When you laid that pair of scissors on top of that blood spatter, it was almost an identical match. And the part that really got it was the thing that they kept saying was the emblem on the letter opener matched that center part in the pair of scissors almost exactly.
Yeah.
And so did the ring.
Yeah. And the prosecution said that round thing
was the letter opener.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And if you looked real close, it's all coming back to me. If you look real close, when you looked at the blood spatter, it wasn't just this. You also saw a little bit of blood spatter right here, which we argued was the second part of the blade.
And John Thebes said I should ask, Judge Khoury about this. He said, yeah, when I had the little trace thing,
Yep.
my hands were shaking so bad.
It was.
Would
And
you
there,
remember about that?
I do, and that was when he tripped over the tripod and Father Robinson smiled. Yeah, he was shaking, and their expert said, "Oh yeah, that looks consistent with that."
Why was he shaking, you think?
Because I'm going to tell you exactly why. Because the number one rule of cross-examination is you never ask a question you don't know the answer to. And he was about to ask a question that he didn't know the answer to, and luckily it worked out for us.
What was the question he was about to ask?
Is this consistent with a pair of scissors? Does this look like a pair of scissors? And their expert agreed.
Yeah.
So tell me how that's not reasonable doubt.
I can also tell you that the juror that I talked to, he said the one thing they said Father Robinson never said, he didn't do it. And I've watched the interviews with the
Mm-hmm.
police. I'm sure you don't think it's a great idea that he even talked to him.
No, right.
But yeah, he never said. And in fact, you know, Tom Ross asked him, you know, Father Swaticki came in and said, how could you do this to her? Or whatever he said, something along that line. And Tom's like, why didn't you say, what are you talking about? I didn't do this.
Well, there was some theory that people had that he did know who did do it, that somebody confessed to him, and that his priest oath was more important to him than anything. That was a theory as well. Again, he was a super, super quiet, meek guy. That was not an act. That was all who he was. It was very hard to believe. He was tiny too. I mean, he's way shorter than me. I'm 5'9". He was definitely shorter than me. And again, you know, they'd say, okay, don't look at the man as he is here now, 60 some years old. Think, you know, back then he was 40, but he was still only 5 foot, maybe 6, maybe, and very meek. And you just look and you're like, is this person? I mean, this is a vicious, horrible, horrible crime. It's one thing to shoot somebody. It's another thing to stab somebody that many times. I mean, stab somebody at all. That is a personal crime.
Do you believe the theory that it was a ritualistic killing?
No. I believe that it was after whomever killed her was done. In my opinion, I agree with the prosecution on one thing. It was a fit of rage killing. That is what I believe. And I do believe that. I believe that after it was done, somebody perhaps made it try to look that way, to draw people off, or to get them honed in on a certain thing.
Yeah. So this was such a, when you think about Toledo history, this will be one of the top 5 that people ever think about when they think of Toledo
Sure.
history. And you guys are involved, you know,
Mm-hmm.
you and Alan and John, Father Robinson. I'm kind of curious about those nights where you kind of gathered over someone's house or around pizza and were kind of thinking about strategy,
Mm-hmm.
whether there's any like particular memory that just kind of jumps out to you.
Not so much. What I remember is, you know, I wasn't, again, I was more, not inexperienced. I just didn't have enough years under my belt. I was young. So I was still, I wasn't as secure financially as those guys are. So I was still working public defender's office, still doing my own job. And then, as most people know, I'm a musician. What I remember is still having a gig down the street, an acoustic gig, and playing, and all of the court TV crew coming out and watching me. That's the kind of stuff I remember from the trial. I remember, you know, my life was still going on, even though it was absolutely consumed by this. When we would get together, we were together nonstop, all of us. I mean, you know, Alan and John and I were close before, but we absolutely, this is a kind of experience that you have that makes an unbreakable bond between 3 people, 4 people if you count Jack, God rest his soul. There were a lot of late nights. There was a lot of, you know, going back and forth. There was a lot of writing, me writing, and then, you know, them having to critique it, and then me having to get them prepped for all of that, you know, because they would be doing the arguing while I was doing the writing, you know. I was in, you know, we were all in the same office building, so we were all together a lot. They're my family. I still consider them my family. Alan is one of my favorite people on the planet. We have dinner with him and his wife all the time, and you know, John, I don't get to see him as much because he's slowed down his practice, but when I get to see him in court, that he was actually, strangely, he was in court on April 5th last year. And I told him to approach. I go, do you know what today is? He's like, no. I said, it's April 5th. He goes, oh. You know, just little things like that. So, like I said, we became a family, for sure.
So did you have your own paparazzi kind of following you?
After the trial, it was really rough because, you know, all you want to do is cry. All you want to do is exhale. And you walk right into the press conference. And then right after that, we had to go do Nancy Grace. And I was waiting for it to be rough, and it wasn't. She was actually very kind to us. It was when you look back, I actually found that video not too long ago. When you look back, you can see it though. You can see it in our eyes. We're just like a shell, we're just going through the motions. I remember after that, I remember going home, and my grandmother and a couple of my friends came over to my house, and I just was finally able to just let it all go. It was a huge release of emotion. It was a lot.